June 15, 1943. The village of Bramley, Hampshire, England. A gentle summer rain tapped against the window panes of the village post office as morning light filtered through the clouds. Postmistress Eleanor Winters sorted through a growing pile of envelopes, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency after 30 years behind the counter. She paused at a cream-coloured envelope addressed to a residence on Church Lane, her eyes lingering on the military postmark from a base just 10 miles away. The fourth such letter this week, she noted, destined for the Pearson household, specifically for their 20-year-old daughter, Margaret. She placed it in the delivery pile with a slight frown. The local military authorities had made their concerns quite clear about such correspondence. Eleanor believed herself a practical woman, not one for unnecessary complications or challenging established ways. What good could possibly come of it? Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is a story of how an elaborate military policy designed to prevent human connection ultimately revealed the extraordinary power of written words to bridge impossible distances, not just across oceans, but across the manufactured boundaries of race in a world at war. 5,000 miles away in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Private First Class James Carter of the 92nd Infantry Division stood at attention under the punishing desert sun. Sweat trickled down his neck as Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Reynolds paced before the assembled men. 250 soldiers stood in formation, their uniforms pressed despite the heat, their faces betraying no emotion as the officer spoke. "Gentlemen of the Buffalo Division," Reynolds announced, using the unit's nickname that harkened back to the black cavalry regiments of the 19th century. "In 3 weeks, you'll be shipping out for England in preparation for the European campaign. You represent the United States Army, and you will conduct yourselves accordingly at all times." The lieutenant colonel paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled men. "The British have different social customs than we do. They don't understand our ways. Their women especially have not been educated about proper boundaries. You will maintain appropriate distance from the civilian population. You are there to prepare for combat, not to socialize. Any violations will result in immediate disciplinary action. Dismissed." The men dispersed toward the barracks, their boots kicking up dust in the parade ground. Private Carter fell into step beside his friend, Corporal William Jackson. "What he really means is stay away from white women," Jackson muttered under his breath. "Same rules, different country." Carter nodded silently. At 23, he had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a postal worker and a schoolteacher. His parents had raised him with a fierce pride in his capabilities and a pragmatic understanding of the world's limitations. He had volunteered within days of Pearl Harbor, believing that service to country might finally prove what should have been self-evident, that he deserved the same respect and opportunities as any other American. 2 years later, he found himself in a segregated unit, commanded mostly by white officers, preparing to fight for freedoms he himself had never fully experienced. "My cousin served with the 93rd in the Great War," Carter said, as they entered the relative cool of the barracks. "Said the French treated them better than their own army did. Wonder if the English will be the same." "Guess we'll find out," Jackson replied, dropping onto his bunk. "Either way, we've got a job to do." In the small village of Bramley, 20-year-old Margaret Pearson worked in the local ammunition factory, her once delicate hands now calloused and stained from handling machine parts and chemicals. Like many young British women, she had joined the war effort, taking on work that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Each morning she cycled 5 miles to the factory, worked a 12-hour shift, and returned home exhausted but proud of her contribution. The village itself had transformed since 1939. The population had nearly doubled with evacuees from London, government workers relocated from vulnerable areas, and now American troops establishing bases in preparation for what everyone knew would eventually be the invasion of continental Europe. "Another letter came for you," her mother said one evening as Margaret entered their small cottage. Helen Pearson's tone carried a note of disapproval as she handed over the envelope. "From Judith at the factory," Margaret replied automatically, though the American military postmark clearly contradicted this claim. She tucked the letter into her pocket and busied herself with removing her mud-spattered coat. "The whole village is talking, Margaret. Reverend Simmons mentioned it on Sunday, not by name, of course, but everyone knew who he meant." Margaret moved to the kitchen sink, scrubbing at the machine oil embedded in her skin. "Reverend Simmons should concern himself with the bombing of children in London rather than who I exchange letters with. You've always been headstrong," her mother sighed. "Your father would have put a stop to this immediately." The mention of her father, killed at Dunkirk in the early days of the war, hung in the air between them. Margaret's shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. Later, in the privacy of her room, Margaret carefully opened the letter. The handwriting was now familiar, precise and thoughtful, with a slight leftward slant. She had received her first letter from Private James Carter 3 months earlier, after a chance encounter during a community dance organized to welcome the newly arrived American forces. The evening had begun with obvious segregation, white officers dancing with local girls, while black soldiers remained confined to one corner of the parish hall. Margaret, working at the refreshment table, had noticed their isolation and deliberately brought trays of sandwiches and punch to their section, engaging in conversation despite the disapproving glances from the American white officers and some of the village elders. Private Carter had thanked her politely, his Philadelphia accent distinct from the southern drawls of many of his comrades. They had spoken briefly about music. He had been studying to become a teacher before the war, with a particular interest in jazz composition. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes, yet something in his thoughtful responses and quiet dignity had stayed with her. A week later, a letter arrived at the Pearson household, thanking Margaret for her kindness and asking if she might be interested in corresponding. Against all convention, she had replied. Now, 3 months later, she unfolded his latest letter. "Dear Margaret," it began, as all his letters did, "your description of the blossoms in your village garden reminded me of spring in Philadelphia, where my mother cultivates roses that would make even your English gardens envious. I've received orders that our unit will be shipping out soon, though I cannot say when or where exactly. The military censors would black out such details anyway. But I find myself hoping that wherever we land in England, it might somehow be close enough that I could see those blossoms you described so vividly." The letter continued with reflections on books they had both read, his thoughts on a piano composition he was working on when time allowed, and questions about her work at the factory. Never overtly romantic, their correspondence had nonetheless developed an intimacy born of shared ideas and mutual respect. Margaret read the letter twice before carefully folding it and adding it to a growing collection hidden beneath the false bottom of her jewelry box, a hiding place that had once concealed childish treasures and now protected something far more dangerous. A friendship that crossed boundaries of both race and propriety. July 23, 1943. Southampton, England. Rain lashed against the ship as it docked in the busy port. Private Carter stood at the rail, squinting through the downpour at his first glimpse of England. After 2 weeks at sea, the men of the 92nd Infantry Division were eager to reach solid ground, regardless of the weather. The disembarkation proceeded with military precision. White units first, then the black units, carefully timed to minimize interaction. Army trucks waited to transport them to their designated bases, the white soldiers to camps near population centers, the black units to more isolated locations. "Welcome to England, gentlemen," said Captain Richard Holloway, as the men of Carter's company assembled beside their transport trucks. "You'll be stationed at Greenham Common, about 50 miles from here. The British have been informed of our specific requirements regarding housing and facilities." Those specific requirements became clear upon their arrival. Greenham Common, while officially designated as an American base, had carefully separated living quarters, dining facilities, and recreational areas. The white and black American units operated as parallel forces, serving the same military objective but inhabiting different worlds. "Just like home," Jackson commented dryly as they were shown to their barracks, a former storage building hastily converted to housing, situated a full mile from the main facilities. Within days, a pattern emerged that would define their experience in England. When on base, segregation was strictly enforced. Off base, however, the British population, while not free from their own prejudices, did not maintain the same rigid color line that characterized American society. This created an unexpected dilemma for military leadership. Black American soldiers found themselves welcomed into pubs, churches, and sometimes homes in nearby villages. Local authorities, while informed of American preferences for segregation, saw no reason to enforce such practices in their own establishments. In London, the War Department's Intelligence Division established a special monitoring unit focused on what they termed interracial correspondence. Military censors, already reviewing soldiers' letters for security purposes, began flagging any communication between black troops and white British women. Special notation was made in personnel files, and in some cases, soldiers were reassigned to different areas if the correspondence was deemed too frequent or familiar. Margaret became aware of the surveillance when one of James's letters arrived, with several lines blacked out by censors. The deleted sections appeared random: comments about the weather, a mention of a book he was reading, nothing that could possibly compromise military security. She understood then that someone was watching their exchange, not for military secrets, but for signs of inappropriate attachment. In his next letter, James confirmed her suspicion. "Our mail is being read more carefully now," he wrote. "Yesterday, Lieutenant Wilson called several men into his office for what he called guidance on appropriate correspondence. I wasn't among them, but the message was clear. They're concerned about friendships developing, as if human connection is somehow a threat to military discipline." Despite the surveillance, their letters continued. Margaret began numbering her envelopes discreetly in the corner, so James would know if any went missing. She also varied her posting locations, sometimes traveling to neighboring villages or asking co-workers to mail them from London. James likewise found creative ways to ensure his letters reached her, occasionally enlisting the help of sympathetic white soldiers who faced less scrutiny. August 30th, 1943, War Department Intelligence Division, London Office. Captain Howard Miller reviewed the latest reports from the Mail Censorship Unit. The numbers troubled him. Over the past month, they had identified more than 300 separate correspondence relationships between black American servicemen and British women. Despite reassignments, warnings, and even the occasional disciplinary action, the number was growing. "They're getting more clever about it," noted Lieutenant Sarah Davidson, one of the few female officers assigned to the unit, "using coded language, alternate addresses. Some letters are being carried by hand to avoid our censors altogether." Captain Miller frowned. "It's creating problems with unit cohesion. The white soldiers see the British treating colored troops as equals, inviting them into their homes. It contradicts everything they understand about the natural order." "The British don't seem to understand our concerns," Davidson replied. "I met with a local magistrate in Hampshire yesterday. He actually questioned why we were monitoring private correspondence between adults. They don't understand the complications that will arise after the war," Miller said firmly. "These relationships, even just friendships, create expectations that can't be fulfilled. When these men return to America, the realities will reassert themselves. Better to prevent attachment now than deal with heartbreak later." He drafted a memo to regional commanders, recommending increased recreational activities on base to minimize the need for soldiers to seek entertainment in local communities. He also suggested limiting town passes for black units and establishing a more comprehensive system for tracking interracial correspondence. What Captain Miller failed to recognize was that such measures often produce the opposite of their intended effect. Restrictions and surveillance only highlighted the artificiality of the boundaries being enforced, causing both soldiers and local civilians to question their necessity. For Private Carter, the growing scrutiny created a complex emotional landscape. His days were filled with rigorous training as the division prepared for eventual deployment to Italy. His unit was practicing mountain warfare techniques, preparing for the challenging terrain they would face. The physical demands left little energy for social activities, yet he found himself staying awake late into the night to write to Margaret. Their correspondence had become a lifeline, not just a personal connection, but a reminder of why the war mattered at all. If they were fighting for freedom and human dignity, as all the official pronouncements claimed, then surely those principles extended beyond the battlefield. Margaret's letters described her daily life with vivid detail. The camaraderie among women at the munitions factory, the village's efforts to maintain normalcy despite rationing and blackouts, her volunteer work with evacuated children from London. She wrote about books she was reading, shared local gossip, and asked thoughtful questions about his experiences. "The factory manager gathered us all yesterday to announce that our production quota has increased again," she wrote in early September. 10,000 more shell casings per week. There was groaning, of course, but also determination. Judith, you remember I've mentioned her before, said something that stayed with me. She said, "Every case we finish might save one of our boys." I found myself wondering if one of our casings might someday help protect you. It makes the blisters and chemical burns easier to bear, thinking there's a direct line between our work and your safety. Such letters, while not overtly romantic, carried an emotional weight that transcended simple friendship. They represented a choice to connect, despite obstacles, to recognize each other's humanity in a world determined to categorize and separate. In late September, an unexpected opportunity arose. Carter's company was assigned to temporary duty delivering supplies to smaller outposts, a 3-day mission that would take him within 10 miles of Bramley. With careful planning and the help of a sympathetic sergeant who assigned the delivery routes, he arranged to have a 4-hour window near Margaret's village. They had agreed to meet at St. Luke's Church on the outskirts of town, public enough to avoid suspicion but sufficiently removed from the village centre to minimize gossip. Margaret arrived first, having claimed to be visiting a friend in a neighbouring community. She sat on a stone bench in the churchyard, autumn leaves swirling around her feet in the crisp breeze. When Carter appeared at the gate, still in his uniform but without his service cap, they regarded each other with a moment of uncertainty. After months of correspondence, the physical reality of the other person seemed both familiar and strange. "Private Carter," she said formally, standing to greet him. "Miss Pearson," he replied with equal formality, before both broke into smiles at the unnecessary protocol. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she admitted, as they walked slowly among the ancient gravestones. "I was afraid I'd be stopped," he acknowledged. "A coloured soldier alone in the countryside tends to attract attention." They found a measure of privacy in the shadow of the church's stone wall. For 2 hours they talked without the delay of postal service or the fear of censors, about their families, their hopes for after the war, the books and music they loved. He told her about Philadelphia, about the vibrant community he'd grown up in, his parents' emphasis on education and dignity in the face of prejudice. She described her childhood in rural England, her father's death at Dunkirk, her mother's struggle to maintain the family home on a widow's pension. "My commanding officer would have me court-martialed if he knew I was here," Carter said as their time drew to a close. "And half the village would ostracize me," Margaret replied, "not because of you specifically, but because of what you represent to them, an unknown, a disruption to their understanding of how things should be. And yet here we are." "Here we are," she echoed, "because their understanding is flawed." Before parting, Margaret gave him a small package, a hand-knitted scarf and a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. "For the Italian winter," she explained, "the mountains will be cold." Carter reached into his pocket and pressed something into her hand, a small wooden carving of a rose crafted during evening hours in the barracks. "Not as beautiful as the real thing, but it won't wilt," he said. They did not touch, not even to shake hands. Both understood that such a gesture, witnessed by anyone, could have severe consequences. Instead, they parted with words that acknowledged what could not be physically expressed. "I'll write as soon as I return to base," he promised. "I'll watch for your letter," she replied. As October turned to November, the correspondence between Black American soldiers and British women became a matter of increasing concern for military authorities. What had begun as a curiosity, a footnote in intelligence reports, was now recognized as a widespread phenomenon. Conservative estimates suggested more than 1,000 such relationships maintained through regular correspondence, with hundreds more involving occasional letters or messages carried by third parties. A special committee was formed under the Military Affairs Division to address what they termed the correspondence problem. Their recommendations were implemented throughout American bases in Britain. Increased restrictions on town passes mandatory lectures on maintaining appropriate social boundaries, and a more systematic approach to mail monitoring. Yet for all these efforts, the letters continued to flow. Some used coded language to evade censors. Others were sent through civilian channels or delivered by hand. The British postal workers, never fully understanding the American obsession with such matters, often chose to look the other way when handling these communications. In late November, Carter's division received orders preparing them for deployment to Italy. The Allied campaign to push up from the south of the country had bogged down in difficult terrain and fierce German resistance. The 92nd would be among the divisions sent to reinforce the effort. In what would be his last letter from England, Carter wrote to Margaret from the embarkation point in Southampton. Military censors, overwhelmed by the volume of mail from departing troops, were performing only cursory checks for obvious security violations. His words reached her unaltered. By the time you read this, I'll be somewhere on the Mediterranean, heading for challenges I can only imagine. I find myself thinking about that afternoon at St. Luke's, how the sun broke through the clouds just as we said goodbye. There's a metaphor there, I'm sure, though perhaps too obvious to be poetic. The Shakespeare you gave me travels in my breast pocket. I've read the sonnet so many times some pages are beginning to wear. Sonnet 116 speaks to me most clearly now. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. I like to think our friendship has proven itself against those who would remove or alter it. Whatever comes next, please know that our correspondence has been a light in difficult times. The world tries to tell us who we can know, who we can care about, who deserves our attention and respect. In defiance of all that, we chose to see each other as simply human. There's courage in that choice, yours more than mine, given the social pressures you face. I don't know when I'll be able to write again. Italian campaigns are notorious for disrupted supply lines, and mail will be far down the list of priorities. But I will write when I can, and I will carry your letters with me. The letter arrived on December 4th, 1943. Margaret read it by candlelight in her bedroom, the blackout curtains drawn against a clear winter night. Outside, frost was forming on the garden paths, and the distant rumble of aircraft, friendly or enemy, it was often impossible to tell, provided a constant reminder of the world at war. She pressed the letter to her heart, then carefully added it to the others in her hidden collection. That night she began a reply, knowing it might be weeks or months before it reached him, if it reached him at all. Dear James, she wrote, his first name appearing on paper between them for the first time, may these words find you safe, wherever you are. December 20th, 1943. Military Intelligence Division, War Department, Washington, D.C. Colonel Richard Wilson reviewed the quarterly report on morale and discipline issues among overseas forces. The section on problematic correspondence between black servicemen and British women had expanded to 15 pages, complete with statistical analyses and representative excerpts from intercepted letters. "Recommendations, Major?" he asked the officer who had compiled the report. Major Thomas Benson cleared his throat. "We've increased monitoring and restrictions, but the situation persists. The British government has been reluctant to intervene directly. They view it as a purely American concern. Our options are limited without creating diplomatic tensions." "And the impact on unit performance?" "That's the surprising finding, sir," Benson replied. "The units with the highest rates of such correspondence also show above-average performance metrics, fewer disciplinary issues, better training outcomes. It's counterintuitive." Colonel Wilson frowned at the report. "Correlation doesn't imply causation, Major." "Of course, sir, but some field commanders have quietly suggested that having connections, relationships that humanize the war effort, might actually be beneficial for morale, regardless of the nature of those relationships." "That's a dangerous line of thinking," Wilson said sharply. "These policies exist for good reasons. The social order we maintain in our military reflects the social order of our nation. We can't have different standards abroad than we do at home." "Yes, sir," Benson replied, though his expression suggested he might personally hold a different view. The colonel closed the file with a sense of finality. "Continue the monitoring program, maintain the restrictions. Document any issues that arise, The European campaign will intensify soon, and these distractions will naturally diminish as combat operations take precedence. And after the war, sir, there are already discussions about managing the return process, particularly for units that have been stationed in Britain for extended periods. Colonel Wilson's expression hardened slightly. After the war, Major, everyone will return to their proper places. That's what victory means, a return to normalcy. January 10th, 1944. The mountains of southern Italy. A bitter wind howled through the valleys as Private First Class James Carter huddled in a shallow foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The Italian winter had proven more brutal than anyone had anticipated. Snow blanketed the rugged terrain, transforming the battlefield into a treacherous frozen landscape where frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy fire. The 92nd Infantry Division had arrived in Naples in early December, then moved northward to join the grinding campaign against German defensive positions. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Every hill, every stone farmhouse, every mountain pass had to be taken through painstaking effort. Carter pulled the wool scarf Margaret had given him tighter around his neck. The small volume of Shakespeare's sonnets remained in his breast pocket, a talisman against both the physical cold and the spiritual chill of combat. He had not been able to send a letter in weeks. The supply lines were stretched thin, and outgoing mail was among the lowest priorities. Yet he composed letters to her in his mind during the long, frigid nights, preserving the habit of communication even when actual correspondence was impossible. Corporal Jackson slid into the foxhole beside him, bringing welcome body heat and unwelcome news. "Command says we move at dawn," Jackson muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "They want us to probe the German line at the base of that ridge." Carter nodded silently. The ridge in question loomed like a spectre in the dim moonlight, its slopes exposed and vulnerable to observation from the German positions above. They had lost 12 men in a similar attempt 2 days earlier. "Also got word that Lieutenant Stevens was transferred back to England," Jackson continued. "Apparently he's been reassigned to some special intelligence unit dealing with morale and communication issues." Both men understood what that meant. Stevens had been particularly zealous in monitoring the company's mail, frequently confiscating letters deemed inappropriate or submitting them to higher authorities for review. "How many of our letters do you think they've read?" Carter asked, his voice low. "All of them," Jackson replied without hesitation. "Every last one. They're more worried about who we're writing to than whether we live or die on these mountains." Carter didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about Margaret's last letter, which had somehow reached him just before they left England. She had described a Christmas concert in the village church, the children's choir performing, despite the absence of so many fathers and brothers, the community coming together despite shortages and blackout restrictions. She had written about hope and resilience in ways that now seemed almost prophetic. "It's not just about us," Carter said finally. "They're afraid of what happens when people start seeing each other as people. Not categories, not ranks, not colors, just people." Jackson nodded, understanding. "That's more dangerous to them than any German artillery." As dawn approached, bringing with it the order to advance, Carter made a decision. If he survived the day's mission, he would write to Margaret again, regardless of who might read his words. Some connections were worth the risk. In Bramley, Margaret continued her work at the munitions factory while waiting for word from James. His letters had stopped abruptly in early December, coinciding with news reports of increased fighting in Italy. Each day, she checked the casualty lists published in the newspapers with a growing sense of dread, searching for a name she prayed she wouldn't find. The village had changed since American troops had first arrived. What had initially been novelty and excitement had settled into routine. The separation between white and black American soldiers, so strictly enforced by the U.S. military, had never been fully embraced by the local population. Pubs served anyone in uniform regardless of color. Church services welcomed all who wished to attend. Homes open to those seeking a brief respite from military life, a few hours of civilian normalcy. This integration, limited though it was, had not gone unnoticed by American authorities. New regulations attempted to designate specific establishments as segregated zones. Military police patrols increased in villages near bases, where black troops were stationed. Official memoranda were sent to local governments requesting cooperation in maintaining appropriate distance between civilian populations and specialized military units. These efforts met with quiet but determined resistance. British authorities, from village councils to regional administrators, responded with polite acknowledgement and minimal action. They had their own war to fight, their own casualties to mourn, their own shortages to manage. Enforcing another nation's social prejudices ranked very low on their list of priorities. For Margaret, the absence of letters from James created both worry and a strange, unexpected freedom. Without ongoing correspondence to monitor, military intelligence lost interest in her. The subtle surveillance she had grown accustomed to, the way her mail arrived obviously opened and resealed, the occasional questioning by unfamiliar government officials about her acquaintances, gradually faded. She used this freedom to become more involved in supporting other relationships between British women and black American servicemen. A loose network had formed, connecting women who found themselves in similar situations. They shared information about which postal routes were less scrutinized, which officials might turn a blind eye, which chaplains or medical officers might carry private messages. They created their own underground postal service, ensuring that words of comfort and connection continued to flow despite official obstacles. February 25, 1944, War Department Intelligence Office, London. Captain Howard Miller reviewed the latest reports with mounting frustration. Despite all efforts, the phenomenon they had been tasked with controlling had only grown more complex and widespread. Direct surveillance had become increasingly difficult as the subjects adapted their methods of communication. "We're seeing evidence of organized assistance networks now," Lieutenant Davidson reported. "British civilians helping to circumvent our mail monitoring, alternative delivery systems. It's no longer just individual correspondence cases." Miller studied the map on his wall, where pins indicated known locations of significant correspondence activity. "How are they adapting so quickly?" "They're motivated," Davidson replied simply, "and they have local support. The British population doesn't share our concerns about fraternization." Miller frowned. "Have we considered more direct intervention, disciplinary action against the most prominent cases? Making examples?" "We tried that in 3 instances last month," Davidson reminded him. "It backfired rather spectacularly, created sympathy for the affected soldiers, turned them into causes célèbres among both their units and the local communities. If anything, it accelerated the problem." Captain Miller removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "The generals want this resolved before the invasion. Once we're on the continent, they don't want to be dealing with disciplinary issues related to correspondence." "With respect, sir," Davidson said carefully, "perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle. These relationships are clearly meeting some need for both parties. Instead of trying to prevent them entirely, maybe we should be focusing on managing the expectations about what happens after the war." Miller replaced his glasses and regarded her skeptically. "Explain." "Most of these women understand the realities," Davidson continued. "They know what America is like for colored people. They're not harboring fantasies about happy endings. They're connecting in the moment during wartime, when normal rules are already suspended in so many ways." "So you're suggesting we allow it? Just let it happen?" "I'm suggesting we focus our limited resources on security concerns that actually impact the war effort. This correspondence, it's not undermining discipline or operational security. In some cases, commanders report it's actually improving morale." Miller turned back to the map, studying the pattern of pins. "The policy comes from Washington, Lieutenant. It's not our place to question it." "Of course, sir," Davidson replied. "I'm merely suggesting a tactical adjustment in implementation." After a long moment, Miller nodded slowly. "Draft a memo proposing a shift to selective monitoring rather than comprehensive surveillance. Focus on cases that show potential for actual security concerns. For the rest, perhaps a less visible approach is warranted." This subtle shift in enforcement policy, replicated across various command structures throughout Britain, created space for relationships to develop with slightly less interference. The official position remained unchanged. Segregation was still enforced on bases, passes were still restricted, Lectures on appropriate behavior were still delivered regularly. But the intensity of surveillance gradually diminished as military authorities directed their attention to more pressing concerns. For those writing and receiving these letters, however, the emotional reality continued to deepen, despite, or perhaps because of, the obstacles they faced. In the mountains of Italy, the fighting intensified as winter gave way to spring. The 92nd Division, along with other Allied forces, pushed northward against determined German resistance. Every mile came at a terrible cost. Villages were reduced to rubble. Ancient churches became impromptu fortresses. Olive groves that had stood for centuries were shattered by artillery fire. Through it all, James Carter continued to write when circumstances permitted. His letters reached Margaret irregularly, sometimes arriving in clusters after weeks of silence. The military censors still blacked out specific details of locations and operations, but they no longer seemed concerned with the personal content of his messages. "The countryside here would be beautiful in peacetime," he wrote in early March. "The mountains remind me of the pictures you sent of the Scottish Highlands, rugged and somehow ancient, in a way that makes our human conflicts seem temporary and small. Yesterday, during a brief respite, I found an orchard where a few early blossoms had appeared despite everything. Life persists even here." In another letter, arriving weeks later, "We've been integrated with white units during several recent operations, necessity overriding policy, I suppose. Strange how quickly the boundaries fall away when we're under fire together. A man's color means nothing when you're both trying to survive the night. Some of the southern boys who wouldn't speak to us at base now share cigarettes and stories in the foxholes. I wonder if any of this will remain when we return home." Margaret's replies were equally thoughtful, though she knew they might never reach him as the Allied forces moved further north, communication lines stretching thinner with each advance. "Spring has arrived in Bramley," she wrote in April. "The garden is coming alive again. Mother has converted most of it to vegetables, of course. The Dig for Victory campaign has transformed every available patch of soil in the village, but she insisted on keeping one small corner for flowers. For the soul," she says, though 2 years ago she would have considered such a sentiment frivolous. "The war changes us in unexpected ways." In another letter, "The factory has increased production again. We're all working 16-hour shifts now. There's talk of the invasion coming soon. No one knows when or where exactly, but we can feel it approaching. The roads are clogged with military vehicles. New units arrive daily. Americans, Canadians, Free French, Polish troops. The village pub has become a miniature United Nations. Everyone understanding that something momentous is coming, no one discussing it directly." Throughout the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for the cross-channel invasion that would become known as D-Day, the phenomenon of cross-racial correspondence reached its peak. Military intelligence estimated that at least 3,000 British women were in regular communication with Black American servicemen, with thousands more maintaining occasional contact. What had begun as individual connections had evolved into a significant social network that defied official efforts at control. The relationships varied widely in their nature. Some were purely platonic friendships, intellectual connections between people who found common ground despite different backgrounds. Others developed into genuine romance, with all the emotional complexity that entailed. A few even resulted in marriage, though such unions faced enormous bureaucratic and social obstacles. What united them all was a shared willingness to see beyond the artificial boundaries of race and nationality, to recognize individual humanity in a world determined to categorize and separate. Each letter that crossed the Atlantic represented a small act of resistance against the dehumanizing forces of both war and discrimination. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord commenced with the largest amphibious landing in military history. As Allied forces established beachheads in Normandy, the Italian campaign intensified, drawing German forces into defensive positions to prevent a collapse of their southern front. The 92nd Division, now battle-hardened after months of mountain warfare, played a crucial role in these operations. For Private Carter and his comrades, the fighting took on a new intensity. They were no longer trainees or replacements, but veteran soldiers whose skills and courage had been proven repeatedly under the harshest conditions. In July, during operations near Florence, Carter's company was assigned to clear a heavily defended village that controlled access to a critical road junction. The fighting was house to house, room to room, a grinding struggle for every foot of ground. By the third day, they had secured nearly two-thirds of the village at the cost of severe casualties. Carter led a small squad tasked with clearing a stone farmhouse that provided the German forces with a commanding view of the main approach. Moving carefully through an adjacent olive grove, they reached the building's blind side and prepared to breach the heavy wooden door. The explosion caught them by surprise, a hidden mine triggered by their approach. Carter was thrown backward by the blast, shrapnel tearing through his left leg and side. The world went silent except for a high-pitched ringing in his ears. Through a haze of pain and confusion, he was aware of hands dragging him to cover, of pressure being applied to wounds, of morphine dulling the edges of his consciousness. He drifted in and out of awareness during the evacuation, strapped to a stretcher, bouncing in an ambulance, finally reaching a field hospital set up in a repurposed monastery. Doctors worked quickly to remove shrapnel and repair damaged blood vessels. His leg was saved, though the muscle damage was extensive. In the hazy aftermath of surgery, Carter remembered the book of sonnets in his breast pocket. He asked a nurse to check if it had survived. She returned with the small volume, its cover stained with blood, but the pages intact except for a piece of shrapnel embedded halfway through, stopping just short of Sonnet 116, the one he had quoted to Margaret in his last letter from England. As he recovered in the field hospital, Carter wrote to Margaret with his uninjured right hand, the words unsteady but determined. "I've been wounded," he wrote simply, knowing there was no way to soften such news. "Not critically, but enough to earn a ticket away from the front lines for now. They tell me I'll walk again, though dancing might be ambitious. The doctors say I was fortunate. The shrapnel missed major arteries by millimeters. But I find my thoughts turning not to what might have happened, but to what did happen. Your book of sonnets stopped a piece of metal that was headed directly for my heart. The military might call that coincidence. I choose to see something more meaningful." The letter reached Bramley in early August, arriving on the same day that Margaret received official notification that James had been wounded in action. The official notice provided no details about the nature or severity of his injuries, only that he had been evacuated to a military hospital. The letter, arriving simultaneously, provided both relief and a more personal connection to events happening hundreds of miles away. Margaret's response was immediate and practical. She contacted everyone she knew with medical connections: her cousin, who worked as a nurse in London, a family friend with ties to the Red Cross, even the village doctor who had occasionally treated American servicemen. She sought information about medical evacuation procedures, about which hospitals received casualties from the Italian front, about how she might send packages or messages that would actually reach their intended recipient. Through this network of connections, she learned that most seriously wounded American personnel were eventually transferred back to England for rehabilitation before either returning to duty or being shipped home to the United States. Black troops were typically sent to segregated medical facilities, often converted country estates in rural areas. Armed with this knowledge, Margaret began another campaign of letters, this time to military hospitals throughout southern England, inquiring whether Private First Class James Carter of the 92nd Infantry Division was among their patients. Most never replied. Some sent form letters explaining that they could not disclose patient information. A few responded with confirmation that he was not at their facility. Then, in late September, a different kind of reply arrived. A brief note from a nurse at a convalescent facility in Wiltshire, just 30 miles from Bramley. The message contained no official information, just a personal note. "The patient you inquired about arrived 3 days ago. He is recovering well and will be here for at least 6 weeks of rehabilitation." The nurse had included no address, no official letterhead, nothing that would identify her or confirm the information. Just a simple statement of fact, one human being quietly helping another. Margaret made arrangements immediately, requesting a rare day off from the munitions factory, securing precious petrol ration coupons from neighbors who recognized the importance of her mission. The journey would require multiple bus connections and possibly some walking, but it was manageable in a single day. October 12th, 1944. The convalescent hospital occupied a Georgian manor house surrounded by extensive grounds. Once the country estate of a minor nobleman, it had been requisitioned early in the war and converted to medical use. Like most military facilities in Britain, it maintained strict segregation, with white and black American patients housed in separate wings and using separate recreational areas. Margaret approached the main entrance with determination. She had dressed carefully in her best clothes, a navy blue dress with white collar that she hadn't worn since before the war, now slightly loose on her factory worker's frame. She carried a small package, books, homemade biscuits, a letter that said everything she hadn't trusted to the mail censors. The reception desk was staffed by a uniformed clerk who regarded her with immediate suspicion. "I'm here to visit Private First Class James Carter," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The clerk consulted a list, then looked up with practiced neutrality. "I'm sorry, but Private Carter is in the colored ward. Visiting hours for that section are restricted to military personnel only." Margaret had anticipated this response. "I have authorization," she said, removing from her handbag a folded document that she placed on the counter with confident precision. The document was, in fact, a letter from her factory supervisor confirming her employment on war production, entirely unrelated to hospital visitation rights. But it was official-looking, printed on government letterhead, and contained enough stamps and signatures to give it an air of authority. The clerk examined it with furrowed brows, clearly uncertain about its relevance, but unwilling to admit ignorance. Margaret waited, her expression suggesting that any further delay would be both unnecessary and potentially embarrassing for the clerk. After an uncomfortable moment, the clerk made a decision. "Very well. Colored ward is in the East Wing. Follow the corridor to the end, turn left, then right at the next intersection. Visiting hours end at 4. Margaret thanked him politely and proceeded down the corridor, her heart still pounding. She had not expected her bluff to work and had prepared several alternate approaches, including simply waiting outside in hopes of spotting James during outdoor recreation time. The colored ward occupied what had once been the servants' quarters of the manor. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, fewer windows than the main house. Approximately 20 beds lined the walls of a long, narrow room. Most were occupied, the patients in various stages of recovery from combat injuries. Several looked up with surprise as Margaret entered. White visitors, especially female ones, were clearly unusual. She scanned the room anxiously, finally spotting James at the far end, seated in a wheelchair beside a window, reading a book. His left leg was heavily bandaged, and he appeared thinner than she remembered, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame. But his posture remained dignified, his attention focused intently on his reading. Margaret walked the length of the ward, aware of eyes following her progress. When she reached James, she stood silently until he looked up from his book. Recognition dawned slowly, then bloomed into astonished joy. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, James," she replied, suddenly shy despite months of correspondence. "I hope I'm not intruding." He closed his book. She noticed it was the volume of sonnets she had given him, now visibly damaged, but still intact. "How did you find me? How did you get in?" "With considerable determination on both counts," she said, smiling. "May I sit?" He gestured to a wooden chair beside his wheelchair, still looking at her with an expression of wonder, as if she might be a hallucination that would vanish if he looked away. For the next 2 hours, they talked without the delay of mail service or the fear of censorship. He told her about Italy, about the fighting, about the moment of the explosion and the strange peace he had felt afterward. She told him about the factory, about the changes in the village as the war progressed, about her efforts to locate him after learning of his injury. They spoke softly, creating a bubble of privacy in the crowded ward. Other patients respected their space, some even positioning themselves to block the view from the nurses' station at the entrance, a small act of solidarity. "How long will you be here?" Margaret asked eventually. "Another month at least," James replied. "Then they'll evaluate whether I'm fit to return to limited duty. The doctors think I will be. The leg is healing well." "And then?" He hesitated. "Back to Italy, most likely. The fighting is still heavy there." They both understood what remained unspoken, the danger of his return to combat, the unlikelihood of another convalescent period in England, the looming question of what would happen after the war. "I can visit again," Margaret said. "Next week, if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," he replied, "though I'm not sure how you managed it this time." She smiled mischievously. "I have my methods, and I'm not the only one finding ways around the rules. There's quite a network now. British women visiting Black American soldiers in hospitals across the country. We share information, strategies." James shook his head in amazement. "They've created an entire monitoring system to prevent exactly this, and yet here you are." "Here I am," she agreed. "Some connections are simply meant to be." When visiting hours ended, they said goodbye with the same formality as their meeting at St. Luke's Church. No physical contact, no outward display of the emotion that both felt deeply. But their eyes conveyed what words and gestures could not. Margaret left the hospital and began the long journey back to Bramley, her mind already planning the next visit, calculating bus schedules and ration allocations. Behind her, James returned to his letter writing, documenting this unexpected meeting while the details were still fresh in his mind. Throughout the autumn of 1944 and into the winter of 1945, Margaret visited James regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes with longer gaps when work or transportation made the journey impossible. Each visit required creative approaches to circumvent hospital regulations. Sometimes she arrived with legitimate-looking documents. Other times she brought supplies that granted her access as a volunteer. Occasionally she simply walked in with such confidence that no one questioned her presence. During this period, James's physical recovery progressed steadily. The wheelchair gave way to crutches, then to a cane. Military doctors noted his exceptional progress, attributing it to determination and positive attitude without acknowledging the motivation that Margaret's visits provided. As the European war entered its final phases, with Allied forces pressing into Germany from both east and west, the military bureaucracy had larger concerns than monitoring hospital visitors. The strict enforcement of segregation policies gradually relaxed in the face of practical necessities and shifting priorities. By February 1945, Margaret's visits were no longer exceptional. Other British women regularly visited Black American patients, bringing books, home-cooked meals, and the simple comfort of civilian conversation. In March, James received new orders. His recovery had progressed sufficiently for return to duty, though not to frontline combat. He was assigned to a supply coordination role in London, a position that would utilize his organizational skills while accommodating his physical limitations. The new assignment meant he would remain in England, at least until the European conflict concluded. This unexpected development transformed their relationship. With James based in London, just 2 hours from Bramley by train, they could see each other regularly without elaborate subterfuge. Weekend visits became possible. They could explore the city together, visit museums and parks, experience something approaching normal life despite the continuing war and social restrictions. During this period, their correspondence continued, now supplemented by in-person meetings. The letters became more reflective, less concerned with daily activities and more focused on deeper questions about the future, about society's expectations, about the world that might emerge from the devastation of global conflict. "I find myself thinking more about after," James wrote in April, just weeks before Germany's surrender. "Not just after the war, but after all of this, after the uniforms and regulations, after the separation and categories. What happens to people like us, who have seen beyond those artificial boundaries? Do we simply return to our assigned places, pretending we haven't experienced something different? Or do we carry that experience forward somehow, allowing it to change us and perhaps in some small way change the world around us?" Margaret's reply addressed these questions with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I believe we're part of something larger than ourselves, not just our personal connection, but this entire phenomenon of relationships forming across supposedly impenetrable barriers. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of similar stories are unfolding across Britain right now. Each one represents a quiet challenge to the system that tried to prevent them. Together they form a kind of testimony, evidence that human connection can overcome even the most entrenched prejudices when given the opportunity. As the war in Europe reached its conclusion in May 1945, military authorities began planning for the massive logistical challenge of returning millions of American servicemen to the United States. Priority was given to those with the longest overseas service, or those needed for the continuing Pacific campaign against Japan. For the men of the 92nd Division, many of whom had been among the earliest to deploy to England, demobilization orders began arriving in June. James, despite his more recent London assignment, was included in the first wave scheduled for return, with a departure date in early July. This news forced a conversation that both he and Margaret had been quietly avoiding. What would happen once he returned to America? They met in a small park near his London office, sitting side by side on a bench overlooking a pond where children sailed miniature boats, a scene of normality that seemed almost surreal after years of blackouts and air raids. "I'll be in Philadelphia by the end of July," James said, watching the children rather than meeting her eyes. "My parents' home at first, then hopefully back to college to finish my degree." Margaret nodded, also focused on the pond. "Will you write?" "Of course," he replied immediately, "as often as before." "And will they still be reading our letters, do you think? Monitoring who corresponds with whom, even after the war?" James considered this. "Probably not with the same systematic approach. They'll have other priorities. But the underlying attitudes, the social expectations, those won't change overnight." "No," Margaret agreed, "not overnight." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the vast ocean that would soon separate them again, not just physically but socially, the return to worlds where their connection would be seen as impossible, inappropriate, even dangerous. "I've been offered a position at the school where I did my training," Margaret said eventually, "teaching mathematics to younger children. The headmistress says they're desperate for teachers, with so many men still away." "You'd be wonderful at that," James said warmly. "You have a gift for explaining complex things clearly. I've seen it in your letters." Another silence, more comfortable than the last. "Philadelphia has excellent universities," James remarked, his tone deliberately casual. "For someone interested in furthering their education," Margaret turned to look at him directly. "Does it?" "It does. And a considerable shortage of qualified teachers, I imagine, especially in mathematics." "That's interesting to know," she replied, a slight smile forming. "For future reference." Neither made explicit promises or plans. Both understood the enormous obstacles that would face any attempt to continue their relationship across continents. Yet neither was willing to simply accept that the connection they had forged through years of correspondence and shared experience should end because external circumstances demanded it. On July 7, 1945, James boarded a troop transport ship at Southampton, one of thousands of American servicemen beginning the journey home. Margaret stood among the crowd of British civilians who had gathered to see them off, many waving flags or holding signs, thanking their allies for their service. Their farewell had been private, away from the public docks and official ceremonies. They had exchanged gifts. She gave him a fountain pen with his initials engraved on the silver band. He gave her his service badge, technically against regulations, but unlikely to be missed in the chaos of demobilization. They had spoken of writing, of staying connected, of possibilities rather than certainties. As the ship pulled away from the dock, James stood at the rail, scanning the crowd until he located Margaret's distinctive red coat. Their eyes met across the widening distance. No waves, no dramatic gestures, just a moment of recognition and acknowledgement before the ship turned toward the open sea. 3 weeks later, the first letter arrived at the Pearson household in Bramley. Postmarked Philadelphia, addressed in a familiar hand. Margaret took it to her room before opening it, maintaining the habit of privacy established during years of monitored correspondence. "Dear Margaret," it began as all his letters did, Philadelphia appears both unchanged and entirely different after 3 years away. The streets and buildings are the same, but my perception of them has been transformed by everything I've experienced. The letter continued for several pages, describing his homecoming, his family's reaction to his war stories, his plans for returning to university. It concluded with a paragraph that Margaret read several times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. I find myself thinking of Sonnet 116 almost daily now. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. We have already defied time and distance, bureaucracy and prejudice. What remains is merely geography and convention, neither of which seems particularly intimidating after what we've already overcome. I've enclosed information about teacher certification requirements in Pennsylvania. Consider it not a presumption but a possibility, one of many we might explore through continued correspondence. Margaret began her reply that same evening, writing late into the night. She would mail it the following morning on her way to the school where she had begun teaching summer classes. The letter would take approximately 2 weeks to reach Philadelphia, where James would read it, respond, and continue the cycle of communication they had established across years and continents. In the files of the Military Intelligence Division, their correspondence remained documented, 2 names among thousands in what had once been considered a significant security and morale concern. As predicted by the more pragmatic officers involved, the systematic monitoring of such relationships ended with the war, the resources redirected to new priorities in the emerging post-war world. Yet the relationships themselves continued. Some remained as written friendships, maintaining connection across vast distances. Others evolved into more complex arrangements, visits, immigration applications, even marriages that challenged legal boundaries in multiple jurisdictions. Most faced significant obstacles, both legal and social. Some overcame these challenges, others eventually yielded to the enormous pressures arrayed against them. What unified them all was their origin in a time when artificial boundaries had briefly weakened, when global conflict had paradoxically created opportunities for human connection across divisions that peacetime society worked diligently to maintain. Each relationship represented a personal revolution against the categorization and separation that defined the era, a testament to the persistence of individual humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. For James and Margaret, the future remained unwritten, a series of possibilities to be explored through continuing correspondence. Their letters would cross the Atlantic for years to come, each one a small act of defiance against the forces that had tried to prevent their initial connection, each one a reminder that some bonds, once formed, cannot be easily broken by distance, convention, or the expectations of a divided world. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.